Okay, let's say you are going on an adventure and you need to assemble a team to go on that adventure with you. How is it that you prepare for that journey? Who else are you thinking of? What traits, what skills do those people need to have to be able to make this a successful journey? That, as an idea, is exactly what we're going to explore today in this book recommendation, because we need to be able to see life as a journey. It's going to take place in very different ways, but there's always going to be an element of a preparation, the journey itself, and then there's the return aspect as well. Now, it might be that these journeys, they actually happen with us as solo travelers. So these might be internal characters that we start to look at. What I'm going to introduce in today's video is the idea of archetypal psychology via this wonderfully practical book, Awakening the Heroes Within. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to have a look at 12 archetypes. Now, when I say the word archetype, what I'm referring to here is a pattern. It might be a certain form or structure or image that we've got in our head that makes sense of the world. If I understand, for example, what a cat is, in theory, that when I see an example of a cat that is running across me in the street, I understand that that is going to be an example of the idea of what it is to be a cat, to use unnecessarily fancy language. I know it's not a dog, for example. I know it's not a fox, even though you could describe them in similar ways. What I'm doing here when I talk about archetypes is I'm trying to see the patterns that underlie the forms. I'm trying to understand the characteristics and the theories and the abstracted ideas so that I recognize the practical examples when I see them. In the same way that if we start to make this relevant for you in your specific life, one of the archetypes might be that of a warrior. When you think of a warrior, you might think immediately of specific examples of real warriors from the past. It might be from books that you've read. It might be from TV shows. It might be from games. But when you understand the idea of warrior, there are certain ideas that come with that. There are certain traits. There are certain weaknesses. There are certain fears. There are certain motivations. There's already an example in your head about what would make a good warrior versus a bad warrior. And that might be different according to each individual person. But what we're doing when we talk about archetypal psychology is we're trying to get in touch with the idea of the healthiest version of that idea, of that form, and bringing that into our life. And if we think about our life, like I was saying before, as this idea of a preparation, a journey, and a return, where there's a transformational element, different parts of me are going to be relevant at different times. If, let's say, when we start to look at an idea like this, if I start to think of like the idea of a warrior, that's going to be fairly useless on the preparation side, because in that case there, I'm going to be able to need to put a plan in place. I'm going to need to be able to think of the logistics. I'm going to have to think about the preparation. What is it that I need to get towards? How am I actually going to get there? If the warrior is going to see the world as a battlefield and wants to take that direct action, that's not the stage for it. That's not the time for it. So in the preparation element, maybe I'm going to need certain parts of my personality to come online so that when I do the next stage of that journey, which is the journey itself, that's where other parts of me can start to come out. To use the same example of that warrior, that might be more useful when I come across a real obstacle as I'm trying to go from point A to point B, because the warrior is going to be, in its healthiest way, very, very protective, very action oriented, very focused on the real world. Whereas if, let's say, I'm thinking about myself in a planning kind of way, let's say is what you might refer to as like a sage or a magician type, someone who is obsessed with this idea of knowledge, then that's only going to get in the way when we actually need to make that progress, because we're going to be over analyzing the situation. So what I'm trying to say is with all of this is there's an appropriate time and place for each of those different energies or patterns that are within us. Now, although I'm referring here to Awakening the Heroes Within, you could actually think about this book as being like the child of two other books that you might already be familiar with. If you're a man watching this, rather than Awakening the Heroes Within, I would definitely recommend instead King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, because rather than talking about 12 archetypes, it's going to focus in on just those 4 instead. The idea being, how is it that you can relate to this idea of the warrior, the magician, and the lover in a healthy sense, understand how you develop to that way, and also start to introduce this idea of shadow psychology as well, as what happens if you're overcharged in one area and undercharged in another. By that, I mean, what happens if you're overly active or overly passive in a certain area? And as soon as you can understand what it is to be a warrior, a magician, and a lover, you can then start to understand what it is to be a healthy king, to be able to keep all of those ideas in place. But likewise, if you are more interested in like the bigger mythological approach to all this, you might have heard of this book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell. Again, it's another wonderful book that goes very much into this idea of the hero's journey, which you might have seen in 12 stages. Again, best simplified by the idea of preparation, journey, and return. The idea with this book that I'm recommending is if you were to link these together and smash these books together, what's going to result? And the result is going to be this. It's going to say, how is life like a journey? And what archetypes, what party members, what people do you need to have on board at different stages of that journey to make it useful and practical and manageable as well? Because just because you've finished a journey and you've sort of gone to the return element and the transformational element, you're going to start another journey anyway. This goes round in a circle over and over and over again. And if we repeatedly come across the same problems, it's probably because we're not particularly identified or attached to a certain archetype. Everybody loves a good checklist, or at least I do. Maybe I'm projecting this onto everybody. But there's so many practical ideas in this where you can start to see, oh, actually, at different stages of my life, I'm really overly attached to some of these patterns and some of these ideas and some of these characters. And maybe others are a little bit sitting in the back and getting a bit underdeveloped instead. If you're someone at this point in time, for example, who likes to play a lot of role-playing games, it'd be like playing a Final Fantasy game and having some characters that you completely over-level and they can just demolish the entire game, and other characters that you just completely ignore and that would really let down the party if they were forced to be in a battle situation. It's exactly the same things here. It might be that you've actually got one pattern or one type of character which is really holding you back in the preparation stage or in the journey stage or in the return stage. And as soon as you're able to highlight that, it's realizing that we just need to apply the right tools in the right areas rather than just preferring 3 tools and hammering away at the world as though those particular tools could solve all problems. It'd be much healthier to have a full toolkit of 12 equally balanced tools to be able to face the problems of the world rather than just 3 or 4 that you're just going to use regardless of the problem. That's what all this is about. It's about balance. So if we're talking about balance for the male psyche, the masculine psyche, then, I mean, this would still be useful for women as well to understand within themselves how this is going to be useful. But especially if you're a man, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover it's a classic for a reason, essentially, all this. When we're looking at archetypal psychology, it's quite hard to not have this book recommended in the male space. If you are interested in a bit more of like a technical analysis and looking at all the different myths from all around the world, I would definitely also check out the Hero with a Thousand Faces. But the official recommendation for this part of the playlist is going to be this, Awakening the Heroes Within, because I think it just combines everything in such a nice practical way that I've just genuinely not seen it in other books that I've read on archetypal psychology. It's helped me to really be aware of which of these patterns that I don't identify with at all. And as a result, because they've been hiding in the background, how that's actually been limiting me. For example, the last archetype that's discussed in here is the Fool. That's something that I don't associate myself with in the slightest. But there's a real reason as to why that might be healthy to be able to encourage that more in my life. The Fool, even though it might sound like a negative thing and quite a derogatory term, it's not about that at all. It's about trying to get in touch with the spontaneous aspects of life, like the wilder approach to life. And maybe if you over rely on order at the cost and at the detriment of the Fool, then there's going to be an imbalance there. So how do we start to readdress that balance? That's been something how I've been able to put this back into practice in my life and be able to see practical change by realizing where my shortfalls are, my shortcomings are, and accepting that vulnerability as just a problem to be solved. So I can actually get that online. So rather than just overly judging myself and being really, really critical, you can probably again start to see how a lot of these books flow together. Can you see now why I started this playlist with this one book, Embracing the Inner Critic? If we can understand that, if you can learn to accept pain and shame and vulnerability, that it makes life so much easier, and it starts to make sense out of all these other books as well, because suddenly we've got a structure to be able to put in place. And it becomes a lot more manageable then to think about how do we actually deal with like a real problem. So what we're going to deal with on the next question in this series is, how do we deal with a book which is considerably thicker than all the others? If the book that I'm recommending on average is about this length, how do you deal with a book that is around this length instead? That's a real formidable process. It's a real journey itself going on trying to read a book like that. And that's what I want to talk about in that next video. So as you are looking at this, it'll be either on the right hand side or just below. There might be a little video that pops up now as well. But what we're going to try to do is realize what are the patterns that are existing inside of us that we need to tap into so that we can actually face the world in a meaningful way so that we can be fulfilled. How, again, as I've said many times over, how do we move towards that desired future in a willing way, in a way which is healthier for us, in an integrated sense, in an authentic sense, rather than survival based. Join me over on the next video to continue this playlist.